Good evening, and welcome to the fourth Berkeley Palmer Lecture. In person again at last, and we also welcome all of you who are watching remotely. It's just a delight to be here again. I'm Susan Phillips, a longtime member of First Pres Berkeley, professor at New College Berkeley and the Graduate Theological Union, and co-chair of the committee that puts on this lectureship. The other co-chair is the Reverend Dr. Tom Elson, who is the mission pastor here at the First Presbyterian Church of Berkeley. New College Berkeley and First Presbyterian Church of Berkeley host these lectures, and this year we are delighted that our Berkeley Palmer Lecturer is Dr. Uriah Kim, the distinguished president of the Graduate Theological Union. Through the Berkeley Palmer Lectures, we're participating in an important conversation at the intersection of biblical studies and our historical situation, which is, as you know, a time now of great achievements and also great upheavals. Even as technology advances, the longevity of democracy is in question. Through global media portals, we witness the ravages of the plague, war, and the tragedy of nearly 30 million refugees now in the world. And we wonder what our role is as the church. Relevant to these issues and also urgent as the subject of this year's lectureship, addressing us as diasporic people, we pray for our hearts and minds to be stretched, challenged, and illuminated by God's grace. The inspiration for this lectureship is with us this evening. As many of you know, the annual Berkeley Palmer Lecture is named in honor of and gratitude for the Reverend Earl Palmer. Please welcome Earl Palmer. Reverend Palmer is here this evening with his daughter, Dr. Ann Palmer, and he was a longtime pastor at this church, now emeritus, and was a founder of New College Berkeley, where he continues to serve through leadership and teaching. In fact, next Saturday, May 7th, Earl Palmer will be teaching here on the Sermon on the Mount. Please join us. And for more than 50 years of ministry, Earl's scripture-illuminating preaching has vitalized the faith of congregants, seminarians, and people affiliated with the university. That, too, is what this lectureship aims to do. Since Jesus' time, people have wondered if those who claim the name Christian are actually living in ways that would please Jesus. We wonder that today. How can we follow Jesus in the world as it is? We bring burning questions and our yearning hearts to the understanding of our lived faith in the academy, the church, in our homes and communities, in the world. And we've done so in the 3 previous lectures. Dr. Craig Barnes, the president of Princeton Theological Seminary, gave the first Berkeley Palmer Lecture in 2018. Dr. Willie Jennings of Yale Divinity gave the second one the following year. And last year, Dr. Ruth Padilla de Borst of the Comunidad de Estudios Teológicos Interdisciplinarios in Costa Rica offered that Berkeley Palmer Lecture. Videos of those lectures are available on the New College Berkeley YouTube channel. And tonight's lecture will be posted there as well eventually. And it's also our pleasure to let you know that we know who the speaker will be in 2023. On April 22nd, Dr. Jin-Young Choi of Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School will give the lecture. So now a few words about the we I keep referring to. For promotional as well as technical support for tonight's lecture, we have been magnificently aided by Devin Crane and Renelle Toro of First Pres Berkeley, Ryan Pemberton of the GTU, and Elizabeth Colvin Watt, Catherine Badalich, and Esther Cho of New College Berkeley. So many thanks to you all. Throughout the year, a committee of dedicated souls, convened by the Reverend Dr. Tom Elson and myself, craft the annual lecture, and I'd like to acknowledge and thank those friends too. Doctors Clay Radke and Jeff Reimer, both professors of chemical engineering at UC Berkeley. The Reverend Michelle Vecchia Lysenga, Associate Pastor for Christian Formation at First Pres, Berkeley. Mary Ann White, Elder and longtime leader within the congregation of First Pres Berkeley. And Dr. Tim Singh, Co-Executive Director of New College. Also serving with us is Grace So, PhD candidate at the GTU and Christian Formation Coordinator at First Pres Berkeley, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm honored to introduce our speaker for the 2022 Berkeley Lectureship. Dr. Uriah Kim earned his PhD from the Graduate Theological Union in Biblical Studies with a focus on the Hebrew Bible in 2004, and also holds an MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary, a THM from Candler School of Theology of Emory University, and a BA in philosophy from New York University. After graduating from the GTU, he was on the faculty of Canisius College in Buffalo, New York, and then that of Harvard Seminary, where he also served as the academic dean for 5 years before returning to the GTU as its dean in January 2017. He now is the 9th president of the GTU and John Dillenberger Professor of Biblical Studies. Dr. Kim is the author of 2 monographs, Decolonizing Josiah, toward a post-colonial reading of the Deuteronomistic history, and Identity and Loyalty in the David Story, a post-colonial reading, and is a co-editor of T.N.T. Clark Handbook of Asian American Biblical Hermeneutics. Tonight's topic is In Search of God, Identity, and Home Within Others. This topic is important to us because it is a lifelong journey for all of us to know God, shape our identity, and befriend people among us. Tonight, our speaker will share more about his faith journey, scholarship, and diasporic experience. Our moderator, Dr. Sharon Jacob, is an associate professor of New Testament at the Pacific School of Religion, a member school of the GTU, and she will be moderating today's Q&A meeting following Dr. Kim's lecture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Uriah Kim with a big round of applause.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Grace, for your generous introduction, and also to Dr. Sharon Jacob for reading an earlier draft and agreeing to give a response and to moderate the Q&A session tonight, especially since this is the busiest time of the academic year. It is indeed my honor and joy, and Reverend Palmer, I'm going to use the word joy, and I want to emphasize that because I seldom use this word these days as the president, but this opportunity indeed is my joy as this year's Berkeley Palmer Lecturer to share with you some reflections and insights from my life, faith, scholarship, and engagement with others. I was debating until last night whether to deliver the long version of this lecture, which is about 7,500 words, or the short version, around 6,000 words. Then I received some feedback from the wonderful people I met yesterday. And they convinced me that although they don't mind the long version, but they insisted that the audience would prefer the short version. So I'm going to go with the short version tonight. Now, I would like to start with an outline of my lecture. I will introduce the three themes: searching for God, identity, and home, in that order, as they unfolded in my life, creating a narrative of sorts, isolating each topic for the purpose of this lecture. Then I will spend the rest of the lecture weaving these three themes by way of engaging with the Bible, biblical scholars, theologians, and philosophers. Theme 1, in search of God. I think I was around 4 or 5 years old and was playing with my friends late into the afternoon, and the sun was setting, and it was getting dark, very dark. And then a thought came to me, something frightening. What happens after I die? After I am no more? This feeling of complete darkness came over me, and pure emptiness churned in my head. And I realized that this is very similar to the description of the world prior to God's creation in Genesis 1. Quote, "Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep." I imagined death, the state of my being, comparable to that of the cosmos before God's creation, and it terrified me. And from then on, from time to time, the concept of death would preoccupy my mind late into my teen years. At 18 years of age, I thought of myself as an atheist, and a very proud one, and a very proud one, because I was telling everybody that I was an atheist. And was looking forward to a bright, exciting, and happy future, ready to do great things, to enjoy my life to the fullest, and didn't want to be bothered with God or anything metaphysical. Then I read Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. And the first 2 chapters in particular disturbed me a great deal. To hear the speaker in the voice of King Solomon, who had achieved and experienced all anyone can ever wish for in life, while reviewing his life from the end point, seeing his life from death, says, Havel Havalim, Havel Havalim, Hakol Havel, vanity of vanities, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. I really think that the writers put Amal Kohelet says, in between for a speaker to sort of sigh and exhale. Let the Ruach leave oneself, as reciting this line. On November 4th, 1984, I became a born-again Christian, the term that was very popular in the 80s. Obviously, this is not the time to go into details about my conversion experience, but what I can share with you tonight is that since that day, whenever I think of death, the deep darkness still fills my mind, but I could sense, as in Genesis 1, the Spirit of God hovering over the darkness. And I am not afraid of that darkness anymore. And there's a feeling of Sabbath and serenity associated with death when I am no more. Moreover, I had an opportunity to commemorate my conversion by selecting a name for myself as the final step in my U.S. citizenship application process. I know there were many names, Paul, John, and so on, Peter, they're very, very popular. I read the Bible from cover to cover and selected Uriah as my new legal name, after the biblical character Uriah the Hittite. The following statement from Uriah, expressing his loyalty to God and his country, resonated most strongly with my desire to emulate his discipline and loyalty to God and to my adopted country. And I quote, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." 2 Samuel 11:11. Theme 2, in search of identity. From 1984 to 1992, as I trained myself to be the best Christian I can be, and that was the most important identity for me during this period of my life. And two principles guided my faith. Holiness, heavily influenced by Jerry Bridges' book, The Pursuit of Holiness, and humility, heavily influenced by The Imitation of Christ by Thomas A. Kempis. In April 1992, I was finishing my first year at Princeton Theological Seminary, preparing myself to be a pastor, even a missionary, ready to dedicate my life to the service for the kingdom of God and the ministry of the Church of Christ. Then on April 29th, 1992, the LA riot started. Exactly 30 years ago. Yesterday. After a trial, jury acquitted 4 police officers of the use of excessive force in the videotape arrest and beating of Uriah Kim, which eventually led to many people and stores in the Koreatown being targeted and looted. For me, on the opposite coast of the United States, as this all too familiar American tragedy played out again, just like it did in May 2020, betrayal, trauma, and awakening followed. Toward the end of the 6-day tribulation, I was taking a shower when I was overwhelmed with emotions and started crying. Tears started to flow slowly at first, and then rushed out of my eyes as if water dam burst. And I couldn't distinguish my tears from the water. I wept loudly like no other time in my life. I did not know at the time exactly why I cried so bitterly. Didn't know how to articulate what I had witnessed. Why I felt so betrayed by my adopted country and fellow Americans, and how it traumatized me and changed how I saw myself in America. My first published article, which came out in 2001, entitled Uriah the Hittite, A Context of Struggle for Identity, summarized and articulated in theological terms my thoughts and emotions that emerged since 1992 regarding my identity and place in America. If you remember, I chose Uriah as my legal name because I wanted to emulate his loyalty to God and country and consider my Christian identity as the most important distinction for my life in America. And I think you know what happened to Uriah the Hittite. He was betrayed by his king, his general, his comrades in arms in order to cover up a sin committed by David the hero of the history and narrative of Israel. But the Bible is absolutely clear that David was punished because of this wrongdoing. And I quote, David did what was right in the sight of the Lord and did not turn aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. 1 Kings 15:5. Yes, yet to my surprise, I found that some rabbis and church fathers tried to excuse David's behavior and even blame Uriah for his demise. That is, the betrayal that I saw in Uriah the Hittite is twofold: in the text itself, but also in the tradition of interpretation, long after the canon was closed. Why this betrayal? He was such a loyal servant. And Uriah is such a fine Yahwistic name. Yahweh is my fire, my light. And no one would have doubted his Israelite identity except for the gratuitous marker Hittite. Does this anything to do with the way he was perceived and treated by David and his army, and later by the defenders of faith and interpreters of the Bible? Oh, how naive I was to think that by getting the U.S. citizenship and passport, by being a good citizen and a Christian would make me an American. I had no idea that I would always be marked as a Hittite, as an other in America. The LA riots opened my eyes to the reality of racialized social-political context of America, what it means to be marked as different. The signs were always there, of course, but I ignored injustices and inequalities that I saw. I dismissed and excused racist remarks and behaviors. I wanted to focus on God and saving souls for eternity, to the extent that I didn't give sufficient attention to what was happening around me, especially to those who were marked as Hittites. I woke from my pious stupor, embraced my hyphenated identity, and made a pivot toward living my faith by making gospel-informed decisions and taking spiritually grounded actions to create a more just and sustainable world. Now, this is not to suggest that I abandoned the mystery, divinity, truth, or spirit that was manifested in the person of Jesus and that of the traditions of the followers of Christ, but to say that I am open to seeing the invisible God through my engagement with others. Theme 3, in search of a home. Where are you from? It's a question that I and others in similar social, cultural, and political positions dread, especially when the questions come from a white person, and it most often comes from them. It's a question that is steeped in the American discourse on identity. To pretend otherwise is to ignore the history of racialized identity politics in the United States. Wittingly or not, the inquirer seeks to put me in a category that's convenient and familiar to their view of who should be an American. They wish to place me over there rather than here. I hesitate whether to give in to their desire, but being a nice guy that I am, I often do and just say, I am from Korea, South Korea. This response eases the tension and negotiation. Now we have settled, the inquirer is satisfied that their inherent right to be here is being acknowledged by placing me over there. Or, if I'm in a playful mood and have some time to spare, I ask, where are you from? The inquirer usually gives their current residence or their hometown. Then I answer, I live in El Sobrante. And so begins, no, where are you from? Oh, well, before moving to El Sobranto, I lived in Hartford, Connecticut for 12 years. No, where are you really from? Then I say, before Hartford, Buffalo, before Buffalo, Berkeley, before Berkeley, Atlanta, before Atlanta, Princeton, before Princeton, Queens, and so on and so on and so on. I know what they want to hear, but I don't comply easily until I hear from them, or at least push them to think about where they are really from as well. Now, I know that the question might be an innocent one, but also a political, cultural, or social one, which I take very seriously. But for me, my inquiry continues beyond these categories to that of theological, ontological, and metaphysical. Where am I really from? There's another familiar utterance that is comparable to the above question. Go back to where you came from. This familiar accusation also functions to place those who are marked as different over there rather than here. It was shocking, but also not surprising that our great leader from the previous administration tweeted what was considered by many to be a racist taunt. Go back to where you came from. Yet many also defended his tweet and said there was nothing wrong with it, that he was just stating a fact, that there were many people, particularly undocumented residents, who should go back to where they came from. I'm sure the irony of this allegation, this claim that some belong to this land and some do not, is not lost to the indigenous population and others who can see the current moment in history from longer periods of time. Now, I am not here to debate this topic, but to reflect on this issue from my life and scholarship, and to share with you tonight that this accusatory statement often leads me to think about, where is my true home? Since my place in America is tenuous and I feel unhomely in my adopted country, and no matter how long I live here, I know there are many people who wish for me to go back to where I came from. In 2009, I visited Korea and stayed there for 4 months during my sabbatical. It was my first visit to Korea since I left as a child in 1976, after a 33-year absence from my homeland, the place of my birth, and of my ancestors. During these months, I did consider whether I could actually go back to where I came from. Overall, I felt at home in Korea, surrounded by faces that looked like mine. I was able to exhale, letting go of the psychological burden of being marked as different in the United States. I was able to easily pass as a Korean and blend in as a host. However, eventually people asked, "Are you from America?" I usually get caught once they hear my Korean or my mannerism akin to failing a shibboleth test. The people just knew that I was not sufficiently Korean, and thereby I was not really one of them. For many other reasons, but especially because it would be so unfair to my two children, I knew I could not go back to where I came from. In the end, I acknowledged my hyphenated identity, that I will not be fully at home either here or there. I accepted the paradox of diaspora, being both a resident host and a foreigner guest, and eventually embraced the hermeneutical privilege that came from such position. Now I will waive these three themes by way of engaging with the Bible, biblical scholars, theologians, and philosophers. The paradox of diaspora. Since the expulsion of Adam and Eve from their home, we're all in some sense living in diaspora. by calling a town, city, state, country as one's home and cherishing the sense of belonging to it, have left all of us inattentive to our diasporic condition on earth. The Hebrew Bible reminds us in telling the history of ancient Israel and story of its people, that no matter how comfortable we may feel in our homeland or wherever we may be living, we need to pay attention to our diasporic situation so that we may fully understand our life on earth and our relation to God and to others. The story of Abraham and Sarah is such a paradigmatic reminder. They left their home and lived their life as sojourners and experienced a state of being both guests and hosts. In Genesis 23, Abraham negotiated with the people of the land, the Hittites. I trust that you see the irony here. To purchase a burial ground for his wife Sarah, even though Abraham had resided in Canaan for decades. He asked for permission from the people for land, claiming his right to do so, and the people do not hesitate to allow him to acquire a real estate for his wife, thus acknowledging his claim. What is particularly interesting for our purpose is how Abraham described himself to the Hittites, quote, a stranger, Gal, and a resident, Toshav, I am among you. Genesis 23:4. Although two nouns are not antonyms, and therefore, strictly speaking, should not be understood as expressing opposite identities, I would even consider the words forming a henditis to mean one idea, resident alien, or in our context, a permanent resident, a green card holder. But many interpreters, especially Jewish commentators, saw the self-description of Abraham as a description of the paradox of Jews in diaspora, where they were perceived by the people of the land as both strangers and citizens. This paradox also served as a guiding principle for Jews to fully participate in civic life wherever they were residing, but also to maintain their own identity and tradition. For example, Jeremiah 29, Daniel 1, and Esther. Although Jewish people were forced to experience this paradox throughout their history, all of us need to understand what is to be guests as well as hosts, even if we are living in our homeland. Without fully embracing the paradox of being a sojourner on God's earth, we will always be susceptible to identifying ourselves exclusively as hosts and seeing our neighbors as strangers, guests, or worse, as enemies. Reading the Bible with Asian Americans. For some time now, Asian American biblical scholars have been reflecting and writing on promises and predicaments, advantages and disadvantages of living with this paradox, and developing hermeneutical strategies for studying and interpreting the Bible. We recognized long ago that we were pawns or victims of long-standing racialized identity politics in America, in which we are perceived and treated as either model minority or perpetual foreigner at the convenience and advantage of those who see themselves as the permanent host. You know, I pay a lot of money for these glasses, by the way, but it's not holding up when I'm a little bit sweating. It's a German brand, pretty expensive. But I do have insurance, and I think I pay 50% of what it costs, but it's not holding up. All right. And it could be because of the mic. There's this thing here in my ear, and it's fighting to hold on. All right. Where was I? Okay. Now, we acknowledge that Asian Americans belongs to two or more worlds or culture, but never completely, and yet at the same time belong to neither, but never detached. We are betwixt and between two worlds that make up who we are and where our home is. We often experience double rejections as well as double acceptance, and that's something that we really need to acknowledge as well. Rejection by the host culture for being foreign, and the rejection by the ancestral culture for being impure. Similarly, this dichotomy partitions one home from another, making it almost impossible for Asian Americans to feel at home here or there. I found Homi Bhabha's term unhomely to be particularly apt in expressing the feeling of estrangement that comes from my home being not mine. Where is home for those who are attached to multiple worlds when the national identity discourse prescribes one home per one identity under one nation? Asian American biblical scholars have contributed to identifying and lifting voices from the Hebrew Bible that struggle with this paradox. Writings like Esther and Daniel, which reflect the diasporic context of Jewish community in the shadow of empire, readily indicate the negotiation and navigation of identity and home they had to face. One of the most common accusations against the minority group, this is what I'm going to do. I know I look funny, but I think this is what I'm going to do. All right. One of the most common accusations against a minority group is that their way of life, culture, or religion is different from the rest of the society and therefore should not be tolerated. And I quote Esther 3:8. There's a certain people scattered and separated among the people in all the province of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not appropriate for the king to tolerate them. End of quote. In an episode in Exodus, the two Egyptian midwives use a false assumption among Egyptians to defend their action to save Hebrew babies. And I quote, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. Exodus 1:19. Their excuse worked because that was what the Egyptians believed, that the Hebrews were biologically different from them. They learn what happens when they're marked as different, that the people or the government in power, whenever there's a crisis, conveniently uses the politics of othering to justify their use of violence. Now, this is not to suggest that people of ancient Israel were only victims of such identity politics. Although they have been commanded to treat a stranger, Gal, same word that Abraham used as a stranger, residing among them in their land as a native-born, as rock, Leviticus 19:33-34. I was so glad to find this verse because it specifically says, treat the Gal, stranger, like the native-born. Okay, Leviticus 19:33-34. There are many incidences when they also mimic their neighbors in mistreating residents within their borders as strangers. They also use politics of othering to mark some to be different for their advantage. More subtle examples involve those who were at first accepted as one of our own, like Ruth, Uriah the Hittite, Rahab, among others. But they were in the end scripted as not quite the same as the Israelites and were marked as different as others. That is to say, the politics of othering plays an important role in shaping the writings in the Hebrew Bible, which reflects the negotiation and navigation of the identity and home of the people of ancient Israel and their scribe who produced the text in the shadow of empire. And the scribes were fully aware of the paradox of diaspora and the danger and opportunity, predicament and promise that comes with it. And the Hebrew Bible often reflects this reality. And I'm going to speak a little bit about my scholarship. I think I became a theologian when I was first introduced to the term marginality by Dr. Sang-Hyun Lee, professor at Princeton Theological Seminary, who was able to explain my predicament in theological terms. In addition to articulating the problem of marginality and dangers of being in such place, Dr. Lee also talked about theological promises and hermeneutical privileges of Korean Americans as sojourners in the United States. The term marginality has lost its appeal for me and for others since then, and much scholarship has been produced in the discourse of othering, especially from post-colonial thinkers, adding such terms like liminality, hybridity, interstitial minorization, among others, to articulate the politics of othering in our time. I now have my own hermeneutical strategy that is not only based on my personal experience, as important as that may be, but more so on a long history of diverse groups of people in the United States who share common experiences and social conditions of being racially minoritized, which is a specific example, an American case of the diasporic situation. By using the vocabulary and concepts developed by post-colonial thinkers, I have framed my efforts within the global movement and the academic discipline inspired and shaped by those who wish to write their own story based on the history and experience of their own rather than following the narrative of the West. My hermeneutical strategy takes into account the paradox of diaspora, and when I read and study the Bible, I try to listen to voices and discourses and look for characters and incidences that reflect this reality. In my research on the book of Judges, I try to give attention to characters and events that provide information and voices that reflect the perspectives from the diasporic context, but are often unattended by those who are concerned primarily from the interest and perspective of a host. That if we pay close attention, then we can recognize the struggle for identity and home as the people of ancient Israel went through the vicissitudes of history. Now, you know what? I'm going to skip this section because this is a little bit, and this glass is really bothering me now. So, this mic, maybe I should do that. Oh gosh. Yeah, you know what? I'm going to take this out, okay, and use the. Testing, 1, 2, 3. All right. I think I'm gonna do that, and just all right. Oh. It's like I was like afraid that it's gonna come off, so my head was like, my neck is killing me. All right. Wow. We're here for you. All right. Thank you so much. All right. Then I'm not gonna skip this section. All right, the scribes who put together the book of Judges tried to forge their own identity as the normative identity for all Israelites. Now, the desire among the writers to establish their own identity as hosts may reflect anxiety and fear among those who have lost their male identity and authority in diaspora. That is, these scribes, because they were part of an empire, they lost their authority and in turn lost their identity. And they were trying to project that into the writings. Thus, I have found that there are many characters who cannot be identified neatly into us, Israelites and hosts, or them, others, enemies, and guests, and fall between these two categories as either belonging to both or neither belonging to none. In order to press upon readers this complexity, I challenge the binary thinking by arguing that such scheme does not work in Judges, but it also does not reflect the historical reality. In the end, it is the desire of those who wish to be the permanent host, contemporary readers as well as ancient writers, to see it that way in order to justify their status and policies that benefit them at the expense of those who have been designated as the Hittites. Ironically, according to the theology of the final editors of Judges, the primary problem with the Israelites' inability to enjoy peace in the land is that they are unfaithful to their God, and their lack of loyalty is directly connected to their mixing with the others or coexisting with the Canaanites and other inhabitants of the land. Although it is obvious that the Israelites still managed to be unfaithful, immoral, and violent even without the others and enemies, and you can read that in chapters 17 to 21, which clearly indicate this. The message to Israel is clear: do not mix with others if you wish to enjoy peace and prosperity in the land. But what to do if the Israelites are not in their own land? There's no doubt that the survival of Jewish identity in diaspora depended on their maintenance of their unique tradition and culture while living peacefully with the others who are in the position of hosts. That their welfare depended on their cooperation with the hosts, or even better, to be counted as hosts to enjoy peace and prosperity in their home that is not quite theirs. They had to negotiate and navigate the paradox while recognizing that grave consequences can result for those who are perceived as different. They accepted this paradox and was willing to live with it in spite of great risk it posed on their well-being. All right, now, encountering God in others, in conversation with Jesus, Levinas, and Derrida. Although the rhetoric used to validate the majority group's position and identity as permanent hosts, as the norm and center, may bring material, cultural, and political benefits to them, they have forgotten their own state of diaspora, and speaking all of us, by the way, the state of our own diaspora, resulting in searching for God exclusively from the position or the desire to be in the position of the host, and thereby impeding their access to God whenever they encounter the other or when they're in the position of the other. There's another approach to knowing God that comes from those who have experienced being strangers in their own home and understand the paradox that enable them to see God through the engagement with others. According to Emmanuel Levinas, the Lithuanian-born French Jewish philosopher, in his book, Totality and Infinity, We can move beyond ourselves, that is, totality of one's world, system, knowledge, and experience, toward transcendence, that is, infinity, God, or the invisible, through our encounter with the others, namely the stranger, the widow, and the orphan, in their naked face. In the face-to-face encounter with those who are different and independent from ourselves, the self must react to the other's presence, providing access to infinity, knowing beyond one's totality, through my welcoming of the other by accepting their moral claims on us. Obviously, this idea had been taught also by Jesus when he said that people will be judged not by what they say or believe, but how they respond when they encounter face-to-face with others in their need, Matthew 25. In fact, Jesus says that when we do not welcome strangers by accepting their moral claims on us, the principle of hospitality, and do not help the least among our communities, we're actually rejecting an opportunity to see the face of Jesus, of revelation of God, in the nakedness of others. Levinas argues that God's, quote, very epiphany consists in soliciting us by his destitution in the face of the stranger, the widow, and the orphan, and concludes that, and I quote, a God invisible means not only a God unimaginable, but a God accessible in justice. Ethics is the spiritual optics, end of quote. Each encounter reveals our ethical responsibility toward the others. Without understanding, experiencing, and acknowledging our diasporic state, we can lose opportunities to see God, revelations which can happen whenever we encounter those who are different and independent from us. Levinas in his book, Ethics and Infinity, and I quote, I am responsible for the other without waiting for reciprocity or I to die for it. Reciprocity is his affair. It is precisely insofar as the relationship between the other and me is not reciprocal that I am subjection to the other, and I am subject essentially in this sense. End of quote. I would argue that it is not only a Christian but also a human moral responsibility, namely to follow the guiding principle of hospitality, to welcome and embrace the strangers who have no relationship with the host, who are independent or different from the subject. Jacques Derrida, the Algerian-born French-Jewish philosopher, who also knows something about diaspora, deconstructs the concept of friendship akin to fraternity by following Emmanuel Levinas's ethical discovery of the other and the subject's passivity to the unconditional priority of the other. Derrida, in Adieu to Emmanuel Levinas, in speaking of Levinas' totality and infinity, and I quote, although the word is neither frequently used nor emphasized within it, totality and infinity bequeaths to us an immense treatise of hospitality, end of quote. Derrida's thesis of new friendship is revolutionary in that it attempts to demonstrate deconstruct the fundamental philosophical principle of the Enlightenment. I think, therefore I am. With the unconditional priority of the other, the ethical significance of this new formula, I think, therefore I am the other, lies in the point that one's moral decision is no longer decided by one's own moral criteria, which I think is the point and teaching of the book of Job as well, which deserves another lecture. That is, the other's moral claims on me becomes the norm for my moral behaviors. Due to the ethical openness to the coming and priority of the other, the preferential option for the other, if you will, Derrida's non-traditional conception of friendship as relationless relation to the other provides us with an important insight in developing and establishing the human responsibility of those who are in the position of a host toward those who are in the position of guests. We're almost to the end. Hesed as the basis of relationship with the relationship of relationless others. In my research on the word Hesed in the Hebrew Bible, commonly translated as steadfast love, mercy, kindness, affection, or goodness, I found interactions based on Hesed to be very similar to Derrida's radical hospitality toward relationless friends, which again is based on Levinas's relations to the others as justice. Among biblical scholars, Nelson Glick's definition of Hesed as a conduct in accord with mutual relationships of rights and duties became a standard with which subsequent scholars engaged since 1926. Glick noted that the responsibility to perform Hesed to outsiders or strangers falls on all humans if one wishes to have a proper relationship with God. And I quote, "Whoever views all men," again, this is from 1926, "whoever views all men as members of his own family and keeps the welfare of the whole human family before him, creates his own leading to the kingdom of God and will achieve communion with God," end of quote. But this aspect is discussed only briefly, and Glick failed to explore further people's obligation toward other people outside one's community or with those who have no prior relations. Moreover, due to his overemphasis on the principle of mutuality, Glick did not explore the possibility of a Hesed based on any principle other than reciprocity, for example, solidarity, and limited the practice of Hesed to the covenantal community rather than to all humanity. Now, there's another scholar named B.M. Bowen who wrote his dissertation at the same time as Glick's book, basically agreed with Glick's definition of Hesed, and in the end also qualified the practice of Hesed to God-believing communities, a larger community than Israel. But the idea that it is an obligation that a religious person owes to all fellow human beings, rather than limiting to one's kin or community, is quite evident in his writing. Are we obligated morally and religiously to extend Hesed to the others, although Hesed is largely understood as ethical conduct obligated to those who belong to the same covenantal community or with those who have prior relationship? The possibility of its practice outside of one's community or with someone without pre-existing relationship allows space where Derrida's friendship may occur and where Levinas's access to God is possible. In this regard, we could say that there is a sudden deconstructive moment in the biblical concept of Hesed, especially in understanding Hesed to be based on solidarity rather than reciprocity, with all fellow humans in response to God's creation. Indeed, there is certain ethical resonance between the solidarity aspect of Hesed, which extends to those who are outside one's community, and Derridian politics of friendship, which goes beyond one's circle of fraternity and community. This ethical resonance is important since philosophical theological foundation of the human moral responsibility is enabled and authorized by this radical spirit of embracing the other beyond political borders or cultural identities. All right, conclusion, finally. We're here, and again, I apologize for not looking at you, and again, that's the whole point of the in-person gathering. Believe me, I love to look at the audience, and I shared yesterday how I get energized by in-person gatherings and so on, and I had no idea I'll be staring at the paper throughout the lecture. And all right, I apologize for that. I think there are three types of relationship between the serf and the other. Two are familiar. There is the conditional relationship based on covenant or contract in which both parties are obligated by legal agreement to fulfill certain duties and responsibilities. When one party neglects their duty, then the other party has recourses, like going to the court to address the breach of the contract. Then there's the unconditional relationship that we all like to talk about as Christians, based on mercy, love, grace, or compassion, in which one person shows favor, even the serf is not obligated to do so, and the recipient does not have moral claims on the serf or merits to deserve a favor. This act would be considered a gift, not a duty or obligation. There is, however, and here I'm introducing something new, right? A third type of relationship, which I don't think many people talk about. So a third type of relationship that is based on chesed, in which two parties are morally obligated, but not legally, to fulfill duties and responsibilities. However, in this relationship, the serf has the moral responsibility to respond to the other without expecting the other to respond in return. It's not the responsibility of the serf to have the other respond. It's the responsibility of the other to make a moral claim on the self. I would argue that following Levinas is the action based on chesed toward the other that enables revelation of God. In short, we cannot say we know God via metaphysics or revelations without extending chesed toward the others via ethics or praxis. It is an obligation that the serf owes to the other, and a person loses an opportunity to discover God if they fail to show chesed to those in need. Finally, I don't think I added anything tonight to the teaching of Jesus Christ, except to put his great command in the most common literary feature in Hebrew poetry, parallelism, and what that implies. Love your God with all your heart, soul, and might. Love your neighbor as yourself. Thank you.
Good evening. I would like to take a moment and thank the organizers of Berkeley Palmer Lectureship, co-sponsored by First Press Berkeley and New College Berkeley, for giving me this opportunity to moderate as well as to respond to Dr. Kim's wonderful lecture. Before I share my thoughts, it is truly an honor to respond to Dr. Kim this evening. As a Bible scholar, there are some folks that inspire your work and have paved the way for many of us. And you, Dr. Kim, have been one such scholar in my academic journey. So thank you, Dr. Kim, for your scholarship, your work, your words, and your testimony this evening. Clearly, we Bible folks have a bad habit of wanting to quote the Bible. So here goes. I want to begin my response by quoting Matthew chapter 8, verses 19 through 20. A scribe then approached and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Your theme this evening, in search for God, home, and identity, and particularly the parallel that you draw between resident or citizen and guest and foreigner, makes me want to connect your theme to this text. The theme of never fitting in, never belonging, is one way to read this text, where Jesus says that while animals and birds both have homes, it is the Son of Man that will never have a place to lay his head. There is a restlessness in this text that is stirring, and I cannot help but connect this to our conversation this evening. In particular, the idea of diaspora, to belong, but never fully in either context. To put it simply, maybe Matthew's Jesus in this text is embodying that feeling of unhomeliness that Homi Bhabha speaks of in his book, Location of Culture. Your question, where is home, for those who are attached to multiple worlds, when nationalist identity discourses prescribes one home per one identity under one nation, is particularly striking. And I want to pick up on a point that you made and maybe even push it some more. You talk about your experiences of going back to Korea after 33 years and the ability to pass, but then realizing that even at home, that your accent and your mannerisms make you the other. And I'm wondering that even in the context of diaspora, there is an idea that we at some point belong. And then with travel and moving around, our homes become multiple. Or as Kwak Pulan reminds us, that in the context of globalization, home is not a fixed or stable location, but a traveling adventure, which entails seeking refuge in strange lands, bargaining for survival, and negotiating for existence. But are there moments, I wonder, where the feeling of not belonging may not even be dependent on leaving or traveling? That those feelings of almost but not quite, the unhomeliness, begin sooner than crossing borders. That they may begin in one's birthplace itself. And how do we begin to address that kind of almost but not quite belonging? Maybe a native, a host, a resident, a citizen, constantly reminded that they will always be foreign or alien and a stranger, even as citizens. Simply put, what happens when diaspora becomes less about physical migration and more about emotional ostracism? A constant reminder that even birth and language can no longer become guarantees of belonging. How would we then read and interpret texts from such places? I also want to say that while these questions are directed to Dr. Kim, I'm hoping that this leads to a larger conversation and that we all engage in it together. My second question is more about the longing for home. While I see your point about home and the ambivalence one feels about never fully belonging, and I recognize that feeling as an immigrant myself, the longing for home, it seems, also never ceases. In fact, going back to Matthew's text, although the text never explicitly says, one can sense that there is a longing for home in the words of Jesus. And will this feeling ever subside for the diasporic individual? Or will our longing for home will always be all-consuming? And we live between those spaces of double ejection or double rejection or double accommodation. And what would that mean and feel like? And could we think more with you on these feelings? These are the two questions that I have. At this point, I would also like to, while we're engaging, also invite folks, if they have questions and comments, to come up to the 2 mics set up here and pose your questions and comments to Dr. Kim. Thank you so much.
I'd like to respond to your second question. I thought about bringing Jesus into this lecture because I always have recognized, Jesus as the, hybrid person par excellence. I mean, fully human and fully God, fully divine. I mean, how much more hybrid can you get, right?
Yeah.
And he comes from, infinity to the temporal and spends 30-some years on earth and go back to the infinity. So obviously, Jesus, not only is he a hybrid individual par excellence, but he also was a sojourner for a short time. And again, if we are following, Jesus as our, Savior and as our teacher, I think he should be our model to live our life, embracing our own hybridity, and understanding the temporalness of our residency on earth. So for me, you're right. There is that article that I wrote, which again, in the longer version, I have that,
Which I actually read the longer version.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And there's that longing.
Yeah,
There's no
yes.
question. Even I knew it. I know in theological sense that I am a sojourner and that I will go back to the infinity or being no more. Yet there is that yearning in my heart where I do want to again be in a place where I can exhale and not have this burden of being, an other. But I don't think I will ever find that here on earth,
Right.
here in the United States or back in Korea or
Korea.
anybody else. So I like, Koipulan's quote, which I had it in the
Yes.
longer version, where, yes, I think this is an adventure.
Yes.
And I love that, term. And that's why I like the image of a sojourner. That we are a sojourner on earth, whether you embrace it and recognize it or not. Too bad if you don't, because again, eventually the end will come,
Right.
as Kohelet says,
Yes.
right? And end will come, and you will be face to face with infinity. Whether you go back to seeing the Maker or being a stardust or whatever. But again, we will come to that point when we will go back to the infinity.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you, Professor, for your lovely lecture. You elucidated a lot of really great things that I will be thinking about in my own scholarship. Forgive me for looking at my phone. I wrote my question down so that it'd be more succinct. You do a very good job of locating your diasporic hermeneutic or an attentiveness to the diaspora in the Deuteronomistic history, right? Looking at Judges, your article, the article you were talking about being in what is it, 1st or 2nd Samuel. I think that's a very interesting choice. I'm thinking about how the theme of diaspora is a much more acute theme, perhaps in the Second Temple literature. Obviously, these distinctions between the literature is very arbitrary, but I'm thinking of, like you gestured towards, Daniel, Esther, Ezekiel. Particularly, I'm thinking about the work of John On here, using migration studies in these diasporic interpretations. My question is, what do you think that locating your attentiveness to diaspora gains, or hold on. What does your attentiveness to diaspora in the Deuteronomistic history, in the time of the setting of the monarchy, what does that gain or lose over where Asian American biblical hermeneutes work on diaspora in Second Temple literature, as those you have gestured towards? Thank you.
Okay. Would you like to answer that?
No, no.
Yeah,
Since I'm New Testament.
yeah,
That's the easiest answer.
that's a complicated question.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not sure whether there's an advantage or not, but I think as a historical critical scholar, I mean, we do have to look at the compositional history of the Deuteronomistic history, and eventually, I mean, you have to go to the Persian era when the Deuteronomistic history was finalized, and obviously in that period, scribes were in diaspora. Even though they write about history, prior to the establishment of Davidic dynasty, and also throughout the reign of David's house, until the fall of Jerusalem. But because the context in which the finalization of the Deuteronomistic history, that is from the Deuteronomy or Joshua all the way to the Second Kings, it would be amiss not to understand and take that context into account. That is, they were under the under the influence of the Persian Empire, and so not to take account of the empire and the diaspora of the Jewish people in the Persian Empire would not be appropriate. So I don't know whether there's an advantage or not, but I think it's something that we have to deal with, and I don't think it's in any way trying to forcefully, trying to make connection to the, Asian American context at all. I mean, one of the things that I teach my students is not to force this comparison when there's not there. There's no need for it, because, and there will be, again, you'll be accused of, anachronism and other things, or imposing your ideology and so on. So I think it is important to, understand and study the context as a historian, and then make a, apple to apple, comparison. And if there is some, connections, obviously we have to, identify it and, utilize it so that it also speaks to our, context.
Yeah. Could I just add something? Speaking from the New Testament, but I think you'd agree, Dr. Kim, I think one of the benefits of post-colonial theory in biblical studies has been, recognizing the ways in which empire influences those of us or those people who are colonized, and how those texts then, when they're written, you cannot deny the way empire affects those texts and their things. So I think there's benefit, So.
And I'll just add one more point, and this is something that I discussed with the group yesterday at 2 o'clock. And one of the, I think, fallacy in modern day people interpreting, especially the Hebrew Bible, is that we tend to read it as if the ancient Israel is at the center, right, as the subject of the ancient Near East or something. when you look at ancient Israel and the writings, really comes from the position of the other, or the position of on the margin, and so on. Yet we, I think, have that desire when we read the Hebrew Bible to see them as the center, and because we wish to be a center, and that's a huge danger there, because obviously ancient Israel was, overall was a petty kingdom, not that powerful in the ancient Near East, but United States, again, Americans are very, very powerful, and it's a very dangerous to equate and see ourselves in Israel.
So I have 2 questions. The first actually kind of pivots quite well in this, because as you talked about the other, the alien, the exile, as well as the widow and the orphan, it gets at both position, ethnicity, identity, social standing, but it also gets at kind of economics and class. And certainly we here gathered represent a certain class. We who engage in this place. So there's a lot of talk about wealth inequality, income inequality. How does that dimension overlay in terms of your thinking of what you've talked about, and how does it influence or blind us in terms of how we think about things? Then I have a second, simpler, more personal question.
Yes, thank you so much. So that's an excellent question, which, again, yesterday at 2 o'clock, we actually had a discussion on that. and I said, and we were talking about the marginality and so on, and I said, it is difficult for me to talk as if I'm at the margin, given that I am the president of the Graduate Theological Union. So, socially, economically, financially, and so on, I am not at the margin. I'm at the privileged position. I am part of the privileged, And so, and it is in a difficult position. And I think, Spivak also talks about this difficulty of being an intellectual. I mean, yes, let's accept the fact that we're not only privileged, many of us here, but again, given that we are in UC Berkeley, and a lot of people I'm sure here are part of that intellectual class, and as such, even though I do talk about people in the position of the other, and it is a dilemma as whether I could actually speak on behalf or speak from that position. But for me, I think I could, and given that my life story, where, and my wife is a witness, we have reached this social position in the last, 5-10 years. But prior to that, I think even financially, we're at the margin. So that's a difficult question to answer. It's something that I think all the scholars, intellectuals, and the privileged individual need to consider very seriously before we start criticizing people who wish to be permanent hosts or people in the center, because we all benefit from this system that we have. And yesterday we did talk about like housing, for example. We are all for affordable housing, except in our backyard. That kind of thing going on. So it is a very difficult issue that I think we all the privileged and the intellectual need to think about. And when we criticize the center or the host and so on, we need to be very careful in that we benefit from this arrangement. And unless you are ready to give up things, just be careful that you are not too harsh, because again, we are benefiting from that system as well, and I'm not sure how much we can speak for those who are absolutely in the position of the other.
So my second, more personal question, and I speak as the son of French, Iraqi, Egyptian, Jewish, Christian parents. You said you really dislike this question of where you're from, which I always find, what do you do for work? There's all sorts of questions we do ask of each other to kind of locate or begin to discover. So my question for you is, what questions do you ask, and what questions would you prefer to be asked?
That's it sounds so simple, but it's interesting because it's me that tends to ask questions. That if someone were to ask me a question, I would say, what Reverend Palmer, asked me, last night when we were having a conversation. I don't know whether he's still here, but he says, do you find joy in your work? And I said, joy is not a word that I would use to describe my work, but yes, I am satisfied, and there's, happiness there. Yeah. So yes, I think there will be a question that I would love to hear from others. What do you find joy in your life? And I will talk about my wife first, by the way, and my wife is sitting over there. So I would say yes, my wife brings joy to my life. I think that's what I would say.
Yeah.
Happy wife, happy life, right? I got that message from the Transformers, by the way, the Transformers. Episode 1.
I don't think it's on, right? Should I go?
Yeah, maybe it's that one.
Hey, thank you for tonight. It was very interesting, sometimes a little overly academic for me, but I want to thank you for that presentation. I guess it's one thing I need to tell you. I'm a Korean immigrant like you. And I went through all those stages where they sat me next to Izumi Yamamoto because they thought that we wouldn't be together or something like that. But what I've noticed, and I'm going to say just a personal thing, I have a family now that's going to get married. It's, Latinx, African American, my wife's white, I'm Asian. And when we have our talks, I'm completely confused. Are you black, African American, are you a person of color, on and on. I'll ask these questions. So my feeling is that we need to have a little bit of grace. So I always tell them, I'm 65, I grew up this way, I'm going to try, I think what you're saying is right, but I don't mean to be offensive. And so I think that's just a commonality that we're going to have to learn in this culture. The Bay Area is way ahead of the rest of the country, but that's just one thing. My question to you, I guess, is the hope. So I heard some really wonderful stuff about definitions, which a lot of, I guess, the postmodern deconstruction, especially with Derrida, talking about labels and how that's so important, the interaction of interaction and defining how that interaction works. So we heard other, host, marginal, and I love the other being the biblical definition of other that you used, women, the orphan. And all that was so revealing and interesting, but for the lay people here, what I need from you is the last part. When you talk about Hesed, we need the theology and the seminaries are doing such a great job of taking on the additional academic stuff that the rest of the academic towers are doing. Definition, deconstruction, dividing, labeling, etc. We need a unifying narrative, to be honest with you, because our churches are having a hard time, we're having a hard time. So when you talk about Hesed at the end, those are the things that I think are the important things for us. And I would just implore that would be the direction that you would go. Create the narrative that we are not righteous, maybe we're the broken, but those are things that are really important. When I think about Hesed, all the Jewish scholars that I talk to or have heard usually use the book of Ruth as that, right? So that's just a good narrative because she is sort of the bastard woman that becomes the mother of David over time. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much. And my second monograph, loyalty and identity in the David story, is all about chesed. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's all about chesed, and when you share that, it really resonated with my thinking. So yes, there will be another lecture, but really, I feel like I have contributed something not only to biblical scholarship but to Christianity and religion in general by really working on chesed as a third type of relationship.
Right.
But in the biblical scholarship, people have not picked it up, which is, I don't know. But this is something that I've been preaching in some ways for, since that book came out in 2008, but it has not gotten much traction. But I really think that chesed as a third type of relationship is, sorry to say it, is profound, in my opinion. And I feel like this really resonates with a lot of believers and people who really want to wish to good things, under the, by following the teaching of Jesus and so on. So anyway, so thank you so much for bringing that up and how it resonated with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Uriah Kim, for your wonderful presentation, and also Dr. Sharon Jacob for your response. I'm a student at GTU, but before becoming a student, when I came here in 2017, I came with a work permit as a pastor. So whenever I fill up any application form, I used to highlight my position or my visa status in this country as non-resident alien. So that word itself the title itself is a problematic title. So I am not good in English, so I just used the Google Translator to find the exact meaning in my own vernacular. Okay. Then that says a person from another planet. So that sort of thing is here. So when you talk about, I was thinking about the visibility of identity. Even though any Asian American or African American or any other people from any other country, when they came here or born and brought up here, used to have the American system of education. So the identity is so visible in many of the people, like many of the racialized groups. So even though they have all the cultural attitudes, perceptions, linguistic abilities to communicate with the society here, when some crucial issues comes, their identity speaks, or they will be categorized by their color or by their appearance. So they cannot counted as a so-called citizen here. So in that case, we have already discussed about the class position. So I wonder how the Jesus considering Jesus's image there, like even though he has no place to take rest, there is no identity conflicts there, like the visibility conflicts there. So that is one question I have. Then the next one, we talk about the Hesed. So that is there in book of Ruth 1:8. It says the Hesed of God, and 2:20 it talks about the Hesed of Boaz, and in 3:10 it talks about the Hesed of Ruth, and that was affirmed there by Boaz saying that you showed Hesed to Naomi, and you said goodbye to your own people, your country, and all the cultural elements there, and you came to this country. But the issue is, and in chapter 4, Ruth is nowhere in the scene. So that is the whole issue. So how we can conscientize people, like bring that idea. You brought a profound idea that can be used as a solution in the conflicts that we have in the wider society. So how can we conscientize with the idea of Hesed? Even in the biblical text, towards the end, it's not a happy ending. The person who showed enormous Hesed was absent, and the place of Naomi was affirmed there. Yeah. And Ruth has no right to even name her children, her child. So that is the whole issue there. Even the text has, I found a problem there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I didn't quite get the question, but I want to say something about Hesed because I think your question was about Hesed and why I think this actually is the third major type of relationship, because there is a couple places in the David story and other places. And this goes against Glick's and others' understanding of chesed as being reciprocal. Okay, and so there's a guy named Ittai the Gittite who says, who gives chesed to David, and David says to Ittai the Gittite, a Philistine, says, you know what, I'm on the run, I'm in the exile. And I cannot return the Hesed. You know that I cannot return the Hesed. But he says, may God return your Hesed to me. Mm-hmm. And I say in my book that that's a very interesting phenomenon, right? Because the person is not expecting, the return response. Mm-hmm. But there is this understanding that somehow God will be involved, that almost God will serve as an insurance, even though that person might not return your hesed. But at some point, God will. And I thought that was a very intriguing idea, and it appears not a lot, but it appears several times where person gives hesed knowing that there will be no return. Mm-hmm. And the person who receives it says, I know I cannot return this hesed back to you, but may God give you hesed. And I thought that was so intriguing. And that's why I think, that hesed relationship falls like between the conditional and the unconditional relationship. Somewhere in the middle that I think is more practical and applicable in real life than the other two relationships. Anyway.
Yeah. Could I just jump in there? Because I think I have that. Yeah. Yeah. But, so your question actually, the non-resident alien, so this was where my first question was coming from too. In the Indian context, if you, even if you're born in that country and if you've not been in India for more than 6 months, you get tagged, you become an NRI, right? Non-returning Indian. So there is a way in which we get ejected out of our own country sometimes, and then when we come here, of course, we're immigrants in this country. But connecting that to Ruth's thing particularly, and I'm sure you know this, Dr. Kim, Gail E's book or her article on Ruth as the model minority, the one who kind of goes through the motions of being the good migrant, immigrant daughter-in-law, who then, is nowhere in the scene, but because two people have talked about Ruth, she does show up in the genealogy in Matthew, right? So there is a way in which the text may erase her in the Hebrew text, but she is showing up in certain places, and I wonder if we can connect that to the Hesed of how God is saying, to this character that she is an important part of the lineage. Those that's my
Yes, I think that's an excellent point.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim and Dr. Jacob, for facilitating today. Let's give them another hand for giving so much to us. My name is Tim Sang, and I'm one of the new directors of New College Berkeley. It takes two of us to fill Susan Phillips' shoes. My partner, Craig Wong, could not be here with us tonight, but I'm sure he too would express his gratitude for this presentation tonight and for our time we had. This entire experience, given where we are today, it feels like as we approach the post-COVID, I don't even dare call it post-COVID, but as we get into this post-pandemic time, it feels like we're stepping into an undiscovered country. So there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear and concern. If we look, and Susan shared with us earlier about all the concerns around us. So because of that, the fact that you're here in person or virtually, I want to give God thanks for you, because you have come together. You're taking the first steps of the sojourn, maybe towards the reign of God. So I just want to thank you all for being here, for being part of the Hesed herd. So, Devin, did you want to put on the last slide? I want to do one more reminder for next year's Berkeley Palmer Lectureship. Thank you. Dr. Jin Young Kim Choi from Colgate Rochester Croce Divinity School will be here, and I have a title of her lecture to share with you. And it's tentatively called The Mystery of the Divine Economy. And it will invite us to perceive the presence of the mystery amidst our life together in solidarity with the invisible, voiceless, and displaced persons in today's world. It's a year from now, but I can't wait. But in any case, again, thank you so much for being here, and I hope to see you all back here again next year. And at this point, I'd like to invite Reverend Tom Elson to come and give us the closing prayer.
Thank you. Before I give the prayer, I have two announcements or two things to say. One is, Dr. Kim, this is from the committee. It's really from the committee through Marianne White, who has put this together, and we're so appreciative of your being with us. And secondly, we have 150 freshly baked cookies that will give you each several of them. They're in the patio across into Mears Hall, and there'll be tea and I think decaf there as well. Thanks to Grace and Michelle for putting that together for us. Let me then close us with a word of prayer. Dear Lord God, we see through a glass darkly. We don't see everything. We don't even see what we see always very clearly. And yet tonight, because we've gathered and heard Dr. Kim, we do see a bit more clearly. We see that you care for all that has been reaffirmed. We understand more about ourselves and others as both host and guest, and that together that combines into being sojourners here. And we're thankful that you are with us in that whole process, that you show up and that you have led and called and guided us. Enable us to remember who we are and who we are not as we live in the beautiful complexity of your world and in the midst of all your good creation and its many interconnected communities. And so we pray all of this in grateful hearts and thanks for all that you have given us this evening. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Thank you. And you're welcome to come over and enjoy the treats.